Hi, and welcome to Women Supporting Women. I'm your host, Valerie Costa, and today we are here with two lovely local authors. We have Lisa Schliff, whose book, would you like to hold it up for us, is called Fire in the Springs. And we have Carol Menaker, I want to make sure I say that right. Carol Menaker, and her book is The Worst Thing We've Ever Done. So, ladies, I'm going to start with Lisa because she's closer, but we are definitely going to get to you in a moment, Carol. Lisa, tell us a little bit about your book.
Well, this book is the result of lots of research and exploration of my family roots. I knew since I was a little child that my great-grandparents immigrated from Germany to Hot Springs, Arkansas. And my mom would tell me little stories, and my grandmother, who lived in us, would tell me little stories now and then. She had a goat in the backyard. Her mother was only 4'8". And that's the protagonist of the story. And as a child, I was interested, but didn't really pay that much attention. And I got to an age, in my middle age, I became much more interested in why they left Germany and why did they settle in Arkansas and in Hot Springs, Arkansas. Mm-hmm. Why? And they were Jewish. What were Jewish people doing in Arkansas? Were there other people, Jews in Arkansas? Was there a synagogue? Why did they move to California? So lots of questions popped up in my mind. And by the time I was ready to ask my relatives, they'd all passed away. Oh. So I turned to research, Ancestry.com, JewishAncestry.com, Library of Congress. I went to the Mormon Temple Family Visitor Center. Amazing resource. You can't take anything out, but you can type it up or make copies, which I did. I wanted to know what happened during the Civil War because my great-grandfather got there in 1859 and my great-grandmother in 1865, which puts them before and after the Civil War. Well, and then they got married in 66, 67. So I had a basic timeline, but no explanation of why or what. Did they meet there? Why did my great-grandmother leave and go to marry a man in the United States? So I found out basically what was going on in history and why Jews would leave Prussia, which was very oppressive toward Jewish people, and why they would go to Hot Springs, Arkansas, which turns out to have be and economically a very good place to be because of the hot springs. Hundreds of thousands of people from not only the country, but all over the world. And so there was business to be had there. So I had the basic building blocks of a story. I just needed to develop a plot, romance, adventure, and that's what I did. I just switched to fiction. Couldn't really find much else on them other than the little bits that I heard from my parents and grandmother.
So that's really interesting. So you took the true life story of your family that intrigued you and then turned it into historical fiction. And so are the characters in the book based on your family members? Did you name them the same? Is it their same journey? Or did you just kind of take that as a springboard and do your own departure?
I actually kept the actual names of them. However, I created a fictional brother, named him Samuel because the name Samuel comes up in my family. And his wife, Gussie, the name Gussie also comes up. So there are some names that are accurate and some names that are fictional. So it's a mix.
And how did you imagine their lives? I'm sure that was a lot of research, but part of writing, and especially a historical fiction book or any kind of fiction book, is kind of the day-to-day, figuring out, getting inside of their heads and their hearts. So what was your process for that?
I really did have to use a lot of imagination. I did a lot of research on the internet. I saw photos of Gleewitz, Germany, the town that they lived in. I read about what it was like there. I had envisioned it as being a little Jewish shtetl, a little, Jewish village. No, it was an industrial city with breweries and rock quarries and a paper mill and bookstores. So I had to address that. Grew up around, and that's what they saw. Going into hot springs, I had to research what life was like there. I got a lot of help from the Mormon Temple Family Visitor Center. There were newsletters written by pioneer women, the actual newsletter in my hand, describing the woods and the animals and the people and what was going on. So I used that to color in, to flesh out the world that they saw.
What a fun process that sounds like. So you actually did go to Hot Springs, Arkansas and visit kind of took that journey.
I did. I flew to Hot Springs and spent a week there.
How were the hot springs?
I took one.
Yeah.
There are only 2 bath houses left out of 9. The others have been converted to hotels and gift stores and something else. But there was one modern one called the Quapaw, which I really wanted to go to. It looked really nice and fancy. But pictures, old one, the Buckstaff, and it was old and quite an experience. And the hot springs it was a lovely soak. You actually get a little cup of water to drink while you're soaking in them, and it was the sweetest water I have ever tasted.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
And so what did we don't want to give too much away, but what did your family do in Hot Springs when they immigrated there?
Well, I was able to get hold of several U.S. Census reports. This was another resource for me that was very valuable. And I found out that my great-grandfather, Carl, his name was Carl, he owned a dry goods store, and his daughter, Henrietta, my great-aunt, Penny, whom I met once when I was about 3, she worked in the store, and he later became a kosher butcher. So I developed his character around those professions. The store is in there. His butcher skills are in there. He developed that as a business.
How wonderful. And for your great grandmother, did you have any kind of like old journals or anything to get a feel for her personality, or did you just make it up based on kind of family?
Well, my mother had a few things to say about her. Her father died when they were very young. She and her brother were very young. She was only 5. And left my grandmother penniless in the South, in Alabama. So Rosalia, this protagonist of the story, came down from Arkansas to Alabama. And so my mother knew her and told me that she was very hot-tempered, which I used that to fashion her character. And she swore. In those times, that was very unusual. And it left me scratching my head, like, why? She swore so badly, my mother told me, that no one in the neighborhood was allowed to play with my mother because they didn't want her around her grandmother.
Oh, poor girl.
Yes. So I tried to work some part of the story as to why she learned these swear words in English. Her native language was German and Yiddish. Why did she do that? So that's in the story.
Oh, that's fun. That sounds like a great book. And you brought a friend here. Why don't you tell us about that?
Okay. This is a corn husk doll. And that also is in the story. I did some research by becoming a docent at Ardenwood Farm. I led groups of people through the Patterson farm. George and Clara Patterson raised there, and I had to get to familiarize myself with an 1890s working farm. It's considered a museum, but it is the only working 1890s farm in the United States, in Fremont, California.
Wow.
So I worked there as a docent, a volunteer. I loved it. And I, one time, and they gave craft classes. So outdoors in the, not inside the house, the museum. But outdoors, you could sit on a bale of hay and do a craft. And one day they had a corn husk doll craft class, which I took. And I made this. It's out of corn husks. And here's the silk from the corn is the hair. And we were told, this was the typical doll that people who were not rich which was most of the people, and couldn't just go out and buy their child a doll, this is what they did. They made these. And so I put that in to the story.
How special. Well, that sounds like a very fascinating book, and I'm wondering where one could purchase said book.
You can go on Amazon.com. You can go on Goodreads.com and get it. And you could go through my website, lisaschliff.com. I have links that go directly to the Amazon and Goodreads sites. Boom. So you don't have to search for me. Just go right there. They're also for sale locally at SBD Market on McKnight. They're for sale at Harmony Books in Nevada City and at Booktown Books in downtown Grass Valley.
How wonderful. Well, thank you for sharing your story with us, Lisa. That sounds like a really great book. I look forward to reading it soon.
Thanks, Valerie.
Now, Carol,
Yes,
it is so nice to have you here as well.
thank you.
Please tell us a little bit about your book. Hold it up so that they can see it. I think your camera's over there.
Well, I love listening to what Lisa has. My experience of the writing of the book was not dissimilar from hers, but my story is very, very different from hers.
Yes.
In 1973, there was a double murder inside a prison in Philadelphia. 2 wardens were murdered. 2 white wardens were murdered, and 2 black men were charged with that crime. That was 1973. In 1976, I had just moved to Philadelphia. I was 24 years old, and I landed myself on a sequestered jury for that murder trial. And I was young, I was naive. A lot of the things that you said about what you didn't know about the world as a child, even though I was 24, I didn't know a lot. I had no experience, obviously, with a crime of this stature. What I knew about criminal justice was what I learned on the Perry Mason show or Dragnet. I had no clue what this experience was. But when one is sequestered, one is separated from their life. And I was sequestered for 21 days in a hotel. And 14 of those days were waiting for the jury, the complement of jurors. It took them 2 weeks to select jurors for this trial because it was very politically, it was a crime of biblical proportions. Let me just say that. I mean, you have to wonder how in the heck inmates could get into the warden's office and kill 2 wardens. It was just the most implausible thing. But it raised a lot of hackles among law enforcement in the city of Philadelphia by the mayor. And the people who lived in Philadelphia at the time of the crime had taken sides already. There was a lot of racial unrest in Philadelphia. And it was an extraordinary experience to be sequestered like that. So for years, I just put it behind me. And jury summons, I would sort of freeze, like, I don't really want to do that again. I've kind of paid my dues in the civic duty department.
Yes.
And I decided that about 2017 or so, I got a jury service from Nevada County, about the 3rd one I think that I got. And I'm not exactly sure what possessed me to rethink all of this, but at that time, I just stopped and thought for a moment. I used to tell stories about my jury service, and most of them I would tell were humorous because the things that weren't funny, really, people didn't want to hear about. And I started to really wonder what happened. Now, the man who was tried, and my trial was convicted, he was sentenced to life without parole. And so then I started to do what Lisa did. I started to look into what really happened there, because when I was on the jury, I couldn't read the newspaper. I didn't live in Philadelphia at the time the crime took place, so I knew nothing about it other than what I was being shown. And so I did the research. I collected all of the newspaper articles with the help of a librarian in Nevada County, and I read everything I could about the time period in Philadelphia that this happened. And there was a considerable amount of racial unrest and a considerable amount of unpleasantness between law enforcement and African Americans in Philadelphia. So this crime really fit right in there. It was very polarizing. And so I did that research, but my book is actually, I call it a memoir or creative nonfiction, because I studied journalism, and so the research that I did helped me to tell a journalistic story about what really happened there. But I also had to dig deep in my memory about the experience of being on that trial and convicting this man. And I also used my imagination because I thought at the time that I and the convicted man who is still alive in prison were the only two living. And the judge and the two attorneys had already died, and I learned about them from their obituaries. Of course, Mayor Frank Rizzo had already died. The key players were no longer around. So I wrote some chapters in which I imagined what they were thinking and doing at the time that all of this was happening. And I tried to be as transparent as I could about that.
So did you go and talk to the prisoner?
I have since talked to the prisoner. I did not talk to him. I met his attorney. I met people who knew him. He knew that I was writing this book. And the big question in my mind, which I didn't know at the time of the trial, was why was he in prison in the first place? And what I discovered in my research was that he was in prison for murdering a white police officer. However, there were multiple petitions that claimed that he had essentially been framed for that. And conclusion after reading all about it, that there was a really good chance that the prosecutors did some things that were unfair and that there was a coerced testimony in that trial. And so the question then was, well, if he didn't do that, he wouldn't have been in prison in the first place. And what were all the reasons that I made the decision to convict when I did?
Well, I think it sounds like you were the ideal juror because you hadn't lived there, and so you didn't have that bias, and all you knew was what was presented in the courtroom. It's kind of like a attorney's like a dream juror, and young and flexible mind. So what an experience that must have been.
Yeah, I actually wrote in my book a few sentences about that, and I described it as being like as if I landed from Kansas in a hot air balloon. That's how perfect I was for to be on that jury.
Yes, yes. And so I'm sure that you have come to some conclusions in the book, but later, do you think maybe he didn't do it, or is that the whole, you have to read the book to find out?
I've become a criminal justice advocate because I wrote this book. And I think, as implausible as this may seem, that Frederick Burton was in the wrong place twice. And he was also a victim of racial injustice. And he's been in prison for 53 years. He's 78 years old. And I have become part of a group of people who've been trying to make his life easier in prison, to have him transferred to a prison that's easier for seniors. And there are just so many things wrong with the criminal justice system. And I don't have any grand hope that Mr. Burton's going to get out of prison, even though he probably should. But there are many people like him who are there for too long with mandatory sentences, sometimes for crimes they didn't even commit. Organizations that are trying to alter this, but it's a complicated thing and you can't just with one swipe solve the problem.
Yes, they're big fans of trying to solve problems with one swipe in all the systems.
It won't work
and
here.
Everything is too nuanced. So what would be the next step then? It sounds like you've become an advocate for criminal justice reform, which is a wonderful thing. Do you hope that your book will kind of move the needle in that?
In the best of all possible worlds, yes, my book would move the needle. I think, in all honesty, the likelihood of that isn't tremendous. But in December, I'll be going to Philadelphia where all of this took place, and I'll be reading at the library there and at another event there. And it seems like that's coming full circle for me because being there where it happened is going to give me an opportunity to be in front of people, some of whom may have been alive, and some who are politically involved enough that they may be able to influence the powers that be to help Mr. Burton.
Yes, well, it sounds like it certainly can't hurt. Would you say that this was one of your kind of defining events in your life? It seems like it would be.
It feels like right now it was. It was, yes, yes. I don't think I knew that at the time until I started to explore what that experience was. And I never thought of myself as being an advocate for much of anything except maybe my children. And I just am positioned now in a place where I feel like there's much work to be done.
Yeah. So what is your next step? Besides going to Philadelphia and doing the readings, which is great, get that out there as much as you can.
At the tail end of my trip to Philadelphia, I'm actually going to visit Mr. Burton in prison. He's in Somerset Prison in Pennsylvania, and my son and I are going to drive there from Philadelphia to visit him. And I am going to try to use the media in ways that I can to elevate this story. Whether it helps Mr. Burton or not remains to be seen. But there, as I said, there are many people who are in prison, particularly people of color, who have been falsely convicted or unfairly convicted. And it's not that hard for that to happen, but it's much harder to turn it around once that happens.
Yes, I've been reading about more stories like that lately where people are found to be innocent because of new techniques like DNA and all the things that weren't available, say 53 years ago, that are now, that show that someone was innocent, but it seems like it's a big convoluted process to actually get them out of prison, even though they've been proven innocent.
It can be, and actually, in reality, more than half of people who are exonerated from prison are exonerated because there was prosecutorial misconduct or police misconduct, meaning coerced testimony or not providing the right information to the defense. So DNA is there. They didn't have that at that time, but it's the criminal justice system that is guiding a lot of these. And even those that are convicted and they find out later that DNA wasn't them, it's for the same reasons. It's just like you come into a story with an idea, and that's the idea that makes sense to you. And so when these cases are formed, the attorneys create the stories about what happened. And then everything that they can find that matches that story is the one that becomes the defense or the prosecution. And they might have been wrong with their hypothesis in the beginning. So it's troubling. And I would like to see change there.
Well, you've taken a big first step. So what a wonderful thing to do. And to purchase your book, how could they do that?
Any online bookstore it can be purchased at. It's at Harmony Books and at the bookseller. If they don't have any copies left, they will get copies for you.
Oh, that's wonderful. So thank you both for being here. Is there anything that you would like to say to the audience? Any parting words, Lisa, about your book? Or
I have gotten lots of good feedback. A lot of people have told me they enjoyed reading it. And just want to add that one of my prime directives was don't bore the reader. I tried to make it as stimulating, interesting, and fun a read as I possibly could while steeping it in history. There is some history there, but lots of adventure. And it's also available at the bookseller store on order only.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because we have two different ways of and two very different stories. How about you, Carol? Last words
Well,
for
this
the
week
audience?
I was very proud to learn that my book was recognized as a finalist in the American Book Fest competition. So that was pretty exciting.
Congratulations! That's
Thank
a
you.
huge deal.
Thank you. I was very pleasantly surprised, and so that's the only thing that I would add.
All right. Well, thank you so much both for being here today. It has been lovely getting to know you and learning about your book. And I wish you great success in your next steps as authors and booksellers and advocates.
Right. Thank you, Valerie.
Thanks, Valerie. It was great to be here.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us for Women Supporting Women. Please come back next month where we will have two other lovely ladies to chat with.